3 months ago, Mark Carney stood inside a Montreal industrial facility and made a promise to Canadians. Canada would never again rely on foreign suppliers for 75 cents of every dollar it spent on its own security needs. Canada would build its own sovereign industrial capacity. Canada would stop sending its procurement dollars abroad when Canadian workers and Canadian companies could do the job instead. That promise just became reality. Canada's Defense Investment Agency is now operational. The $470 billion framework is moving from announcement to execution. The first procurement priorities are being established. The long-term demand signals that Canadian companies need to invest and scale are now being sent. And the timing of this implementation matters enormously because it is happening at precisely the moment when the assumptions behind decades of Canadian security procurement have been most visibly exposed as insufficient. When the relationship with the primary foreign supplier became unpredictable. When dependency stopped feeling like efficiency and started feeling like vulnerability. What Canada is now building in response is not just a larger security establishment. It is a genuinely sovereign one. And today, we are going to explain exactly what that means and why it changes Canada's position in the world.
Defending Canada means more than just increasing the size of our military. It also means the strength of our industries, the resilience of our economy, and our capacity to act independently when it matters the most. Our national security and our economic security go hand in hand.
National security and economic security go hand in hand. That framing is the core insight driving everything in this strategy, and it represents a genuinely significant shift in how Canada is thinking about both. For most of the post-war period, security spending in Canada was treated primarily as an obligation, something Canada did because its alliances required it and because the threats of the era made it necessary. The economic dimension was secondary. You spent what you needed to spend and accepted that much of that spending would flow to foreign suppliers with more established industrial capacity. What Carney is now arguing, and what this strategy is designed to operationalize, is that this separation was always false. Every dollar Canada spends on its own security needs is also an economic decision, a decision about where jobs are created, where research and development investment flows, where supply chains are built, where industrial capability compounds over time. When Canada sends 75 cents of every procurement dollar to foreign suppliers, it is not just making a purchasing decision. It is making a choice to build foreign industrial capacity instead of Canadian industrial capacity, to create foreign careers instead of Canadian careers, to develop foreign supply chains instead of Canadian ones. And that choice, made repeatedly over decades, produced the dependency that Carney committed in February to reversing. 3 months later, the reversal has begun. The Defense Investment Agency is live. The Build, Partner, Buy framework is now policy, and $470 billion is beginning to move through Canadian industry rather than out of it.
And the truth is, over the last few decades, Canada has neither spent enough on our defense nor invested enough in our defense industries. We've relied too heavily on our geography and others to protect us. And this has created vulnerabilities that we can no longer afford and dependencies that we can no longer sustain.
Dependencies that we can no longer sustain. That phrase is the most honest thing a Canadian Prime Minister has said about this subject in a generation. Because the dependency Carney is describing did not happen through negligence or incompetence. It happened through a series of rational, short-term decisions that produced an irrational, long-term outcome. Buying from established foreign suppliers was faster. It was often cheaper in the immediate term. It avoided the complexity of building domestic industrial capacity from scratch. And for decades, the relationship with the primary supplier was stable enough that the dependency felt like a reasonable trade. What changed is not Canada's needs or Canada's values. What changed is the reliability of the assumption that the supplier relationship would remain permanently stable and permanently aligned with Canadian interests. And here is where the connection to the broader economic moment becomes impossible to ignore. Because the same logic that drove Carney to diversify Canada's trade relationships, to sign 20 new economic agreements across 5 continents, to pursue free trade negotiations with India and the ASEAN bloc, applies with equal force to the security and procurement dimension of Canadian sovereignty. A country that depends on a single partner for the inputs to its own security is a country whose negotiating position in every other conversation with that partner is subtly but meaningfully weakened. You cannot negotiate from genuine strength when the other side of the table knows that your capacity to act independently is constrained by products and supply chains that they control. Carney is removing that constraint systematically. With $470 billion and a strategy designed to ensure the investment produces durable sovereign capability rather than simply more spending.
By diversifying these partnerships, we reduce our exposure to any single alliance or any single decision that we don't control. And defense depends on complex supply chains, from critical minerals to specialized components. Accordingly, we're launching the Canadian Defence Industry Resilience Program to secure key supply chains for our armed forces.
Strengthened by smart partnerships. That distinction is critical, and it is the part of this strategy that is most likely to be misunderstood. Because when Carney talks about reducing dependency on foreign suppliers and building Canadian sovereign capability, the immediate assumption in some quarters is that this represents a turn toward isolationism, a pulling back from alliances, a rejection of the integrated continental relationship that has defined Canadian security arrangements for generations. The strategy is the precise opposite of that. The framework Carney announced is build, partner, buy, in that order. Build where Canada already has or can develop sovereign capability. Partner with trusted allies where Canada cannot build alone, and only buy from abroad after exhausting the first 2 options. The partner component is not an afterthought. It is a deliberate and central element of a strategy designed to diversify Canada's security relationships the same way Carney has been diversifying Canada's economic relationships, not away from the United States, but toward a broader set of trusted partners that includes Europe, the United Kingdom, and allies across the Indo-Pacific region. The landmark agreement with the European Union on defense procurement, the deepening security partnerships with Nordic countries, the new intelligence and technology sharing frameworks being built with like-minded democracies. All of these are expressions of the same strategic logic. A Canada that is connected to multiple reliable partners is a Canada that is never entirely dependent on any single one of them. And that diversification is precisely what makes the strategy credible as a sovereignty instrument rather than simply a spending commitment.
The centerpiece of our new approach is the Defense Investment Agency, or DIA. The DIA will streamline and speed procurement. It'll cut red tape, and it'll expand domestic production. It has 3 fundamental objectives. First, to protect Canada's sovereignty, particularly in the Arctic, by ensuring our women and men in uniform have the tools they need to defend our country. Secondly, the DIA will work to build Canadian prosperity. And thirdly, will work to strengthen Canada's strategic autonomy, which means our ability to act independently in a more dangerous world.
Our ability to act independently in a more dangerous world. That phrase is the entire purpose of the Defense Investment Agency, distilled into a single sentence. And the agency itself deserves attention because it addresses what has historically been Canada's most persistent problem in this area. Not the absence of commitment or resources, the absence of execution capacity. Canada has announced ambitious procurement programs before. What has repeatedly derailed them is a procurement process that is, in Carney's own words, too slow, too fragmented, and too reactive. A process so complex that Canadian companies frequently find it easier to sell to foreign governments than to their own. A process that adds years and sometimes decades to timelines and billions to costs, while the capability gap it was supposed to close continues to widen. The Defense Investment Agency is designed to solve the execution problem rather than simply add another layer of commitment on top of an unchanged process. Streamlined procurement, reduced administrative complexity, long-term demand signals that give Canadian companies the certainty they need to make the investments required to scale their capacity. A clear priority framework that puts Canadian suppliers first, allied partners second, and international purchasing third. That framework matters enormously for the industrial development dimension of the strategy, because building sovereign industrial capacity in areas like aerospace, cyber, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and autonomous systems requires companies to make long-term investment decisions. And companies only make long-term investment decisions when they have reasonable confidence that the demand to justify those investments will actually materialize. The Defense Investment Agency creates that confidence, and confidence is what converts a spending commitment into an industrial strategy that actually builds the capability it promises.
This strategic autonomy doesn't mean isolation. It means being strong enough to be a partner of choice rather than a dependent. It means building a domestic defense industrial base so we are never hostage to the decisions of others when it comes to our security.
Never hostage to the decisions of others. That is the standard Carney has set for what this strategy must deliver. And it is a standard that has direct and immediate relevance to every other conversation Canada is having with the world right now. Because the trade conflict with Washington, the diversification of economic partnerships across 5 continents, the record foreign direct investment numbers, the new agreements with Asian and European partners, all of that diplomatic and economic momentum is built on a foundation of sovereign capability. Canada's ability to make and sustain independent decisions depends ultimately on whether Canada has the industrial, economic, and security infrastructure to back those decisions up. A Canada that depends on foreign suppliers for 75 cents of every dollar it spends on its own security needs is a Canada whose independence is partially theoretical. A Canada that produces 70% of its own security procurement domestically, that has diversified its partnerships across trusted allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, that has built world-leading capability in aerospace, cyber, quantum, and artificial intelligence, is a Canada whose independence is real and durable. That is what $470 billion over a decade is designed to build. Not a larger security establishment, a genuinely sovereign one. 125,000 new high-paying careers across the country. Defense sector revenues up 220%. Exports in this sector up 50%. Research and development investment up 85%. A new agency to make sure the spending produces the capability it promises. In this century, as Carney said in Montreal, the work of defending Canada is the work of building Canada. Security and prosperity are not competing priorities. They are the same project. And Canada just committed $470 billion to proving it. Subscribe to this channel for analysis that goes this deep every time.